It's now my pleasure to introduce Nathan Sales, the newly confirmed and appointed Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the U.S. State Department. He was sworn in about 4 weeks ago on August 10th, as I think one of the first Assistant Secretaries of the State Department. Before joining the state, Ambassador Sales was a law professor at Syracuse University College of Law, where he taught and wrote in the fields of counterterrorism, national security law, constitutional law, and administrative law. Before that, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security and has a long career in helping keep America safe. We're very honored to have him present today's keynote. Ambassador Sales.
Well, thank you, thank you, Blaise, for the introduction. Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to start with a special word of thanks to Governor Kane, Congressman Hamilton, and Mr. Benveniste for their excellent work, for their leadership on the 9/11 Commission. The 9/11 Commission drove the nation's debate about how to respond to that dark day in our history. And it also served as a needed voice for the families of the victims. Governor, Congressman, and Mr. Benveniste, thank you for your vital work, which continues to play a central role in how we as a nation understand the terrorist threat and how we respond to it. Now, I mean that in a very literal sense. Two of your former staffers actually work for me at the State Department, and I can assure you that I'm keeping them very busy. I'm also grateful to the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me and for keeping Washington's focus on these vital issues. You've put together a really extraordinary program today, and it's a real honor and a real pleasure for me to be part of it. I was just rereading the 10th anniversary report card the other day, and I was struck by the continued relevance of the report and its 41 recommendations. One sentence in particular stood out to me. We must constantly assess our vulnerabilities and anticipate new lines of attack. Now, that's basically our job at the CT Bureau. The run-up to the anniversary of 9/11 is a time to take stock, to reflect, and to analyze our counterterrorism efforts. But it's also important, and perhaps even more important, to reflect on how our enemy has evolved. Now, in these remarks, I'll outline the different threats we've faced since 9/11, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the emerging trend of what we might call self-directed terrorism. These are attacks that are inspired by terrorist groups, but not necessarily ordered or controlled by them. After that, I'll explore our responses to date and where we think we should focus our efforts going forward. So let's start with the evolution of the terrorist threat over the years, beginning with Al-Qaeda. From the 1990s up until the present day, Al-Qaeda has had two salient features. First, it maintains a hierarchical, centralized command structure. Osama bin Laden at the top, terrorist operatives at the bottom who receive orders and carry out instructions. Second, Al-Qaeda seeks to carry out large-scale, spectacular attacks on high-profile targets. In the late 1990s, we saw Al-Qaeda's ability to make good on these threats. The 1998 bombings of two of our embassies in East Africa killed over 200 people and injured more than 4,500 others. 2 years later, on October 12, 2000, Al-Qaeda attacked the USS Cole as it was refueling in Aden Harbor, killing 17 American sailors and injuring 39. All of this led up to the Plains operation. On September 11, 2001, 19 Al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial jetliners and turned them into missiles. 2 of the planes were flown into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers, symbols of our nation's economic might, causing them to collapse. A third hit the Pentagon, the nerve center for the world's most powerful military. A fourth, perhaps bound for the Capitol building, crashed in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, when the 40 passengers and crew of Flight 93 heroically stormed the cockpit in an effort to overcome the hijackers. In all, nearly 3,000 people were killed that day and more than 6,000 injured. It was our nation's deadliest day since Antietam. Fast forward to 2014. After we killed Osama bin Laden and degraded Al-Qaeda's central leadership, a new form of the same threat emerged. Like its predecessor in Afghanistan, ISIS developed a centralized command to order attacks outside of its false caliphate in Iraq and Syria. We witnessed its work in Paris. On November 13th, 2015, a group of suicide bombers and gunmen, dispatched by Raqqa, committed a series of 6 coordinated attacks. They targeted a soccer stadium, cafes and restaurants, and the Bataclan Theater during a rock concert. 100 people were killed, including 89 at the Bataclan alone. Nearly 400 others were injured. Yet alongside these and other centrally planned plots, a new threat has arisen. Terrorist attacks increasingly are being carried out by individuals and small cells who are inspired by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but who aren't acting on the group's orders. They're self-directed. These smaller scale, individually planned attacks often involve soft targets like hotels, tourist resorts, and cultural sites. We've seen this deadly new trend across the world. Places like Berlin, Jakarta, London, Manchester, and Nice. We've also seen it closer to home. Think of Orlando and San Bernardino. So what accounts for this increasing rise of self-directed terrorism? Well, I think that there's 2 factors at work here. First, ISIS is losing. The so-called caliphate is crumbling. With support from the Defeat ISIS coalition, local forces have liberated more than 3/4 of the territory ISIS once held in Iraq, and about 2/3 of the territory it held in Syria. This loss of safe haven makes it harder, not impossible, but harder, for ISIS to plan external operations. Second, ISIS's prolific use of social media has expanded the group's reach. The group is capable of radicalizing and giving advice over the internet on how to conduct attacks. Aspiring jihadis, therefore, are able to attack soft targets at home instead of traveling to the conflict zone. The question then becomes, what do we do about it? How should the United States and its allies respond to these different kinds of terrorist threats? Well, after 9/11, we adopted a number of new tools that were geared at disrupting and degrading a hierarchical, centralized adversary like Al-Qaeda. For instance, we improved the intelligence community's ability to intercept terrorist communications. One example is Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, which made it easier to collect the emails and phone calls of non-Americans who were located overseas. We also ramped up our efforts to block terrorist financing. And we made border security a top priority. We started collecting fingerprints from visitors to this country. We signed agreements with partners around the world to share information about known and suspected terrorists, the so-called HSPD6 agreements. And we started analyzing airline reservation data. This is known as passenger name records, or PNR, to flag people who might deserve a little extra scrutiny at the customs checkpoint. Now, these measures have proven extraordinarily effective against centralized adversaries like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And make no mistake, we'll need them for as long as that centralized threat persists. But in an age of self-directed terrorism, they're not enough by themselves. We need to retool our approach in light of the more decentralized adversaries we now face. Why do I say that? Well, consider surveillance. Self-directed terrorists aren't necessarily communicating with headquarters, so they can be harder to monitor. Or consider financing. Self-directed terrorists don't need the deep pockets of a large organization to commit their atrocities. They can simply rent a truck and drive it into a crowd. Or consider border security. Self-directed terrorists don't need to travel. They don't have to cross borders to receive training, to receive funding, or to carry out attacks. Many of them are operating on their home turf. So what do we do about it? What do we do about the rise of self-directed terrorism? Well, at bottom, we need to ensure that our counterterrorism toolkit is flexible and nimble enough to address evolving terrorist tactics, technologies, and trends. Let me highlight a few specific measures that I think will be instrumental as we confront an increasingly decentralized, self-directed terrorist threat. First, the protection of soft targets. Last month's attacks in Barcelona were only the most recent reminder of the challenge of securing locations that by design are supposed to be opening and inviting. That's why the CT Bureau is working with international partners under the Global Counterterrorism Forum to draft a set of good practices on the protection of soft targets. We plan to finalize and announce these recommendations publicly in the near future. Stay tuned. In the meantime, we've been training partner countries who have the political will to protect their soft targets, but who may lack the necessary resources to do so. For example, last year, in response to an attack on the Radisson Blu Hotel in Mali, the CT Bureau funded a program to build effective crisis response teams in that country. On June 18th of this year, terrorists attacked again, this time at the Hotel Kanagaba. The CT-trained team led the counter-assault, killing the attackers, and more importantly, freeing civilians who were trapped in the hotel. Second, there's information sharing. After 9/11, we tore down the information sharing walls that kept our cops and spies and soldiers from sharing information with one another and talking to one another. Our friends and allies around the world need to do the same. For instance, the imam at the center of the Barcelona plot was a convicted criminal. He'd served a sentence for drug smuggling and indeed had been ordered to be removed from the country of Spain. But he wasn't on the radar of counterterrorism officials because none of his past offenses involved terrorism. This was also the case of the Nice attacker, who had a series of arrests and convictions of his own. These aren't coincidences. A recent study by the George Washington University found that 57% of the people who were involved in terrorist attacks in Europe and in North America between 2014 and 2017 had prior criminal histories. So we've got some work to do here. We need to step up our work with foreign counterparts to dismantle the stovepipes, to tear down the walls that block the free flow of this kind of counterterrorism information. Third, there's capacity building. At the CT Bureau, we're helping our partner countries improve their handling of terrorism cases. In particular, we're building their ability to investigate, to prosecute, and to adjudicate terrorism-related crimes. A good example comes from the Balkans, a key transit route for foreign terrorist fighters who are heading to Syria or Iraq or heading back home after having served in the conflict zone. In the past few years, 131 people have been convicted under newly passed foreign terrorist fighter laws in the Balkans. Justice Department lawyers, funded by the CT Bureau, have assisted local prosecutors in evidence organization, analysis, prosecution strategies, and case-specific challenges through a case-based mentoring program. There are now about 33 more defendants who've been indicted or who are already on trial, all of them in Kosovo. In conclusion, the terrorist threat is constantly evolving, and along with our friends and partners around the world, we must evolve to meet that challenge. We must remain vigilant against an al-Qaeda on the rebound and an ever-adaptive ISIS. And we must update our toolkit to ensure that we have the capabilities we need to confront the new scourge of self-directed terrorism. The 9/11 Commission had it exactly right. We must constantly assess our vulnerabilities and anticipate new lines of attack. And so, Governor Kaine, Mr. Benveniste, thank you and thank your colleagues for that charge. And thank you for the inspiration to continue your indispensable work of securing our homeland and protecting our people. Thank you. And thank you all.
So I wanted to thank Ambassador Sales for his remarks and take this opportunity to also thank the people whose hard work made both this project and this event possible. On the project, Jessica Michek, Adam Klein, Mike Hurley, Blake Hollister, Sam Tadros for all their work. And on the event, Emily Kim, Dora Engel, and many others at BPC. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second and last panel of the day. We've heard throughout today's proceedings about the role of ideology in terrorism, the need to confront and battle terrorist ideology, and to discuss the difficult question of what the connection is between terrorism, violence, and ideology, what the content and substance of the ideology that fuels terrorism is. It's my pleasure to announce our second panel, starting with, if they could all wanted to come up, that'd be great, Jasmine Al-Gamal, who's a resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, where she focuses primarily on the role of narratives in the cycle of radicalization and violent extremism. Jasmine has been at the center of the fight against terrorism, from serving as a translator in Iraq to working at the Department of Defense, including as a special assistant to 3 undersecretaries of defense for policy. Dr. Tarek El-Gawari, who's the president of the Coexist Foundation, and is both a Princeton and Al-Azhar University trained Islamic scholar. Sir John Jenkins, whose long career in the Middle East on behalf of the British Diplomatic Service. I can't even begin to list all the postings, but they include Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, Jerusalem, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Saudi Arabia, pretty much everywhere you'd want to go in the region, and as well as leading the UK review of the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam. He's currently a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University. Unfortunately, Ambassador Alberto Fernandez was not able to join us at the last minute, I'm afraid to say, but I think we will still have an excellent panel, especially moderated by Graham Wood, a correspondent for The Atlantic. I'm sure you all read his excellent article that was, I think, circulated pretty much in every corner of Washington last year on what ISIS really wants, and whose book, On the Way of the Strangers, Encounters with the Islamic State, I commend to all of you. So with that, Graham.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center, and congratulations to BPC as well for this report, which I encourage you all to read, to create a bipartisan report that takes into account Islamist ideologies. An especially difficult task. All bipartisan tasks are, but this a contentious, highly politicized issue. It's like trying to produce a bipartisan report on the Yankees-Red Sox rivalry or on the relative merits of House Stark and House Lannister. So, well done. Now, the discussion of ideology, there is in the executive summary of this report a couple lines that I'll begin with, suggesting at least what we're talking about, some definitional issues. It says ideology, even in scholarly studies, is most often treated as synonymous with a worldview or a belief system, but it's not about how things are, but how they should be. It influences not navigation of the immutable features of the real world, but action meant to change the temporary and conditional structures of society and politics. So with that as the turf that we're working on, I wanted to start with you, Sir John. You've been working in this field for a while, and you're a person with low tolerance for cliches and pieties. So I wonder if you might start by just giving us a sense of what some of the misconceptions are about the role of ideology in politics in general, and what the role of ideology is in violent movements in particular.
Thanks, Graham. I like your Game of Thrones analogy, by the way. The last time I looked at Game of Thrones, I didn't notice any ideology in Westeros. It's one of the things that makes everything so susceptible to dragonfire. I think when I look back on my experience in government and dealing with this particular set of issues at the end of my time in government, I think there are 3 sort of deformations that struck me then and strike me still very forcibly. The first is that ideology doesn't exist or doesn't matter. And I think this is interesting because it's a sort of vulgarization of the pure Marxist view that the only thing that matters is the economic base, the economic underpinning, which of course is one of these the reasons why people talk so much about the answer to this being solving the economics, providing jobs, education, all these sort of things, which are important in lots of different ways, but don't necessarily address the problems we find ourselves confronting now. If you look at something like the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, you think of the sort of people who join violent extremist groups, not just Islamists, but also if you think about the Red Brigades or the Red Army faction in Germany in the 1970s, these tend to be quite highly educated and quite often quite middle class sorts of people. So there's something about ideology which is really important, and it matters, and it's not just about the material base or the economics. That's one thing. The second deformation, I think, is that ideologies are static and clearly defined. I think it's one of the ways in which people have tried to interpret what has happened in the Middle East and the wider Muslim world in terms of the rise of these movements over the last 20 to 30 years. And actually, if you look back to the debates that were had in the British government, the US government in the 1940s, coming out of Egypt as the Muslim Brotherhood arose as the most powerful organized mass mobilization movement in the world. You get the same sort of sense that people want to define this as something that is static, that is there and doesn't cross boundaries. Actually, everything we know about these ideologies tells us that they're dynamic, they metastasize, and they influence each other. And people move from one bit of the ideology to another. We see this with individuals. The late Egyptian scholar Hussam Tamam did an awful lot of extremely good work very early on this question of the Salafization of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Brotherhoodization of Salafism. And these cross-currents, which actually we now trace back to at least the 1960s, and in some cases to the very foundational moments of the Muslim Brotherhood, have meant that the Brotherhood is constantly, and its associated groups, and groups like Daesh and Al-Qaeda and so forth, are constantly changing their direction. In some ways changing the way that they frame themselves, but it also means they're highly adaptive. And the third deformation, that also means, there is a real issue about what we can do about these sort of ideologies, not what non-Muslims can do about these ideologies. Brings you on to the third deformation, which I think is, for all us good Western liberals, we tend to think we're not ideologues, that we don't have an ideology. Actually, we do. Liberalism is as much an ideology as anything else. And I remember having a conversation with the former Prime Minister David Cameron about this as I was doing the Muslim Brotherhood Review, and I said to him, Prime Minister, you talk a lot about the importance of British values in this, and this is a way to what are those values? Is it cricket? Is it drinking warm beer? What is it? And if you don't articulate what these values are, it's very difficult to articulate what it is that people are expected, what the tolerance level in any given society is for deviationist, radical, challenging revolutionary beliefs. We tend to assume that liberalism includes everything. Actually, it doesn't. And even John Locke would have said it didn't. I mean, John Locke would have excluded from his ideal republic Catholics, of which I am one, on the grounds that Catholics owed allegiance to an external power, the Pope, which is analogous to the sort of debates that people have about Islamists these days within the Middle East. So you have to find a way to decide, or to articulate in a much more convincing way in the public space, what it is, why liberalism is such a good thing, and why our particular societies are valuable beyond, above and beyond the challenges of these other ideologies. We live in a world of ideological challenge. Those are my three.
Thank you. Would either of the other panelists like to comment on misconceptions, any other shibboleths, cliches that have afflicted us on this?
I agree with Sir John, actually, that I agree with what you said about ideologies not being static and having to change and having to mold to whatever the context is at the time. And I think, if you look at the equation of terrorism, how someone becomes a terrorist, there are all of these different factors that lead to someone becoming a terrorist. And those factors are pretty static. The one factor that isn't is the ideology, right? And so you have someone with a grievance, and then there's a lack of an opportunity to address that grievance in a healthy, constructive way. And then you have the ideology that comes in and captures their imagination. And then you have the means. So how do you actually get there? Whether it's traveling somewhere or doing something inside your home. And so the fact that the ideology, for example, ISIS, if you look at how they were trying to get people to travel to Syria and Iraq in the beginning, their message was different depending on what audience they were speaking to. They didn't just have one message, right? So for young women, it was come live in this idyllic place where you can be good Muslim wives and mothers and things like that. And it was a very peaceful, idealistic vision of an Islamic state. If they were targeting young men, it was more about the excitement and the power and this and that. If they were targeting older people, it was a different message. And so to say that there is an ideology that we have to combat with our own, I think fails to appreciate and acknowledge all the different factors that go into becoming a terrorist. And it's an easy way out in a way. It's an easy answer, but there are no real easy. I mean, it's an easy prescription, but there's no way to actually do it.
On the other hand, though, what you're describing are many paths toward one endpoint. So does it not matter that the endpoint is what it is? When we're talking about the value of ideology as a tool that we would use to combat this, then getting to that endpoint, of course, there are many ways you could get there, and you're going to be trying to convince a young woman or an old man to get there in different ways. Mm-hmm. But if we're thinking about how to combat this, is there some way that we can combat, no matter what the stream is, what the final destination is, in ideological terms?
I don't agree. I think the answer is no, and here's why. By the time people get to the place where that violent ideology, that radical Islamism, if that's what we're talking about, by the time they get to the point where that resonates with them, it's too late to change their mind. Do you know what I mean? They've already been through various layers and levels of transformation in themselves. At each point at which we could, as governments or civil society or NGOs who are trying to combat that, there is a response to that. So if it's economic, then that is something that you can address in a tangible way. If it's social, if it's identity-based, all of those are things you can address at varying points throughout the radicalization process. But once you get to the point where they have latched onto the ideology, they're only doing it because it justifies and it provides them with justification for stuff that they had already, come to believe, and for things that have already happened to them. And the ideology is it's almost the check to say, you're okay, it's okay to do this, and here's why.
Tarek, I would like to bring you into this. You are a practitioner. You have been working in Nigeria and Somalia.
Practitioner of what?
A practitioner of what we used to call CVE, but might better be called preventing violent extremism. Okay. And you, not a practitioner of jihad, if
yes,
that's
okay.
the term. So now, tell me, is it too late once someone has got to that point? Is ideology just the hardest turf on which to combat or to prevent violent extremism?
So I think I'm at heart really an optimist. So I think that I believe in the goodness of humanity fundamentally, all humans. So I feel that both personally and because of my theological training, I believe we can reverse these things. I think the only exception is when somebody has a gun. When somebody is in the act of creating violence, inflicting harm. I'm not going to negotiate with somebody that has a gun. I'm going to duck for cover or look for a bigger gun, and that's why we have to have law enforcement. But short of that, I think it's doable. And the way I look at it is I think that the ideology of extremism, or any ideology for that matter, it's going to fulfill some sort of human needs. And if it's a negative ideology, it's going to fulfill those human needs in a negative way. If it's a positive what we call positive ideology, it'll fulfill those needs in a positive way. So I like to think that Islam for me fulfills my needs, but in a positive way. I try to work with people, I try to help people, I try to raise money for charity, and I disperse these funds blindly in the sense that we don't give them, the funds to people of a certain religion or a certain class and things like that. But I can fulfill those same needs in a negative way, and that's where addictions come in, and that's where violence comes in, and that's where abuse comes in. So I think these people fall in the same category. In the 1980s, the experience in Egypt was that the Brotherhood, people that were jailed in the 50s and 60s, so on and so forth, there was a long process with the security apparatus fueled by the training of Al-Azhar to help have these people renounce violence, and it worked. Now, some of them renounced the renouncement, and so they bounced back. But when I talked to my teachers who taught me, and I asked them their experience, they said, look, we look at extremism in concentric circles, and we're able to bring people to the left 1 or 2 circles, but that's it. So if we find a violent person, we can get them to renounce violence. If we find an extremist Salafi, we can get them to be like a moderate Salafi. That was their experience. I think we can do better than that, because I believe if we can understand their needs, then I think we can fulfill those needs in a positive way by grafting on it an ideology that's also positive and constructive.
So I would like you to tell me a bit more about some of the efforts to on, let's just say, purely ideological grounds, combat, for example, ISIS. I know there was a famous letter to Baghdadi that was written by many Muslim clerics who oppose ISIS, and that type of effort I would describe as purely theological, legally, looking at the history of the religion, and not addressing any of the questions about whether someone through material conditions has been brought to a point of desiring to go to ISIS. What type of fruits have been born with that kind of effort?
So this is what I noticed. People like Baghdadi, Adnani, Shekau, Boko Haram, these people, they are Hollywood actors. They are using props. They are using colors. Shekau will give a talk holding it looks like he's holding like a tree trunk. And I looked at the video, I was like, oh my God, that's miswek. This is prophetic truth. But it's like this big. It's like literally like a tree trunk, that he's holding.
This is Shekau, the Boko Haram.
Boko Haram. What was al-Baghdadi wearing the day that he gave this Ramadan khutbah? He was wearing all black. He was wearing a black thobe, a black abaya, and a black turban, because when the Prophet, peace be upon him, entered into Mecca, he was wearing imamatun sawda, he was wearing a black turban. It's a sign of state power. So many of the caliphs, when they would give formal things, historically they would wear black. These are all props. So even though the letter was theological in nature, because scholars are trying to show that this is wrong, they are specifically picking these things, names. His name is not al-Baghdadi, but he thinks that this is somehow more Muslim, that his name is al-Baghdadi or al-Adnani or al-Libi or al-Misri or something like that. So they're doing these things on purpose, but the problem is that they take these things way out of context. If somebody gave me one of the themes that they heard extremist, any theme, jihad, hakimiyya, anything, I'll give you the verse and the prophetic text that they're referring to. I can put in one column every single Sunni Shia scholar in the history of Islam, how they've commented on this verse. It'll be on one column, and then you'll find the interpretation of ISIS, Boko Haram, etc. on another column, all by themselves. They're beyond heresy. They've created a new interpretation that is no one's even thought of those ways of understanding them before.
And when you point this out to someone who is at some point along this path toward radicalization, is it persuasive? Is there a track record of people seeing this, oh, there's another way to interpret this, and then being persuaded? Or is this something that they're just flying headlong toward, whether you tell them that or not?
So I was telling someone last night, it depends on what I'm wearing. If I'm dressed like this, probably not. If we're in Washington, probably not. If I was wearing, my Azhar regalia, maybe. If I was, if I had some street cred with them, maybe a little bit more. It depends, it depends. But the problem I found is that on a high level, I can convince people what I just said. I can say, okay, you're saying this verse. No, no one in the history of mankind has ever interpreted that verse this way. It's just a fact. Okay, I understand. But then when we get into the minutia, we find that there's been a constant feeding of this heretical, what I call heretical narrative for the last 200 plus years. That really has to be dealt with. So eventually somebody's going to say, but Nasr al-Din al-Albani says this about the hadith. I said, yeah, but that guy was a joker. That was a disaster of a project. He contradicted himself and didn't know about it. When I say that, people get offended. Yeah, but that's Shaykh al-Islam, Nasr al-Din al-Albani. If you go to the Qatari Awqaf website and you ask a question, they'll give you a fatwa back quoting the hadith strength and weakness based on Nasr al-Din al-Albani. That's a disaster. Absolute disaster. So underneath, it's like an iceberg. Like the tip I can kind of deal with, but it kind of goes down a little bit deeper. And I'm trying to find creative ways by not, as you can tell, I'm not very PC. I'm trying to find a way to be diplomatic, to be respectful of people's way of thinking. People are very emotional about this issue in the family of Islam. So I'm always hopeful. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
So John and Jasmine, I'm going to ask you a version of the same question as to the applicability of ideology to policy and to government. Sir John, when we first met, we were introduced by Emma Sky, who said, you two are both jihadism nerds and I'll leave you to yourself, and then walked away rolling her eyes. And then we talked about the recent seerah that had come out of Abu Muhammad al-Adnani. So it seemed as if, it seems as if to some people within government, this is a kind of disreputable preoccupation, a jihadist ideology. What is the use of it? Is it something that is just a hobby, or is it something that can be applied within policy and government?
I think people find it very difficult to deal with because it's very complex. It seems very exotic, very remote from the concerns of government. I think, going back to what Tariq was saying, the things that the Egyptian government and the scholars of Al-Azhar did with the Al-Ghamad al-Islamiyya people in the 1990s, actually, the 1990s in Egypt, was very interesting and very effective. And the Saudis have done something similar in their de-radicalization centers in Riyadh. The rate of success of those centres is not as great as the Saudis claim. It's much smaller, I think. But they've had some success. And some of that have been because of material factors. They've socialized people. They've given people houses. They've got them married. They've brought them back into their families and the rest of it. And these things are really important because a lot of this ideology as well is focused on networks of people you know, you trust, family networks, associates, and so forth. So some of it is also very personal. This also speaks, in a sense, to the fascinating and very French and very amusing controversy between Gilles Kepel and Olivier Roy at the moment about, whether this is the Islamization of radicalism or the radicalization of Islam. In a sense, it's both. I think what Roy underestimates is the sheer power of a teleological, deterministic, and sacralized narrative, which of course is part of this, which is one of the core appeals of this ideology. If you think about the great ideologues of the 20th century, one of the greatest was Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci, as I said yesterday, is the most unsuccessful practical revolution of the 20th century at the same time. And in university departments are stacked full of people who think Gramsci is fantastic. His ideas have lived. And this is a man who actually rejected God. If you add God to this mix, it makes it even more powerful. So if I'd spoken to the head of the security service in the UK 5 years ago, he would probably have said that we are looking at 1,000 persons of interest, 1,000, ticking ideological bombs. A British minister about 3 weeks ago came out and said there are 23,000 people of interest out there. Now, people of interest is not necessarily ticking bombs, there are 23,000, but somewhere there's been a massive increase. And this is in spite of de-radicalization being delivered through the radicalization centers and also from 20,000 feet. And you can do a certain amount with things that go bang from 20,000 feet, but what you can't do is kill ideas. Now, I think there's an interesting, if you look back to when the Brotherhood trajectory, I'm thinking about the Brotherhood in particular, but you have this historical perspective, from the 1940s onwards. Now, Al-Banna, in the famous letter towards the light, Nahwa Nur, which he sent to Farouk, he says, the West is decadent. The West has destroyed itself, it is finished. That was the start of the most successful period, in many ways, in modern Western history. It was certainly the start of the most successful period of modern American history, when America became the predominant economic, military, financial power in the globe, from a position which was only incipient in the 1930s. You've got the rise of the European Union, you've got the economic miracles in Germany, France, and so forth. And this was an extraordinary time of growth. And although the Brotherhood, of course, was suppressed by a deliberate act of the Egyptian government after Munshir in 1954, I think there was a connection between the rise and the power of alternative ideologies, and some of this was Western, but in the Middle East it was also Arab nationalism and so forth, a lot of it militarized. And there seems to have been a connection as well with the weakening of those ideologies, the weakening of the attraction, or the failure, the material failure of those ideologies, and the resurgence of Islamist ideologies. And I think this speaks to us as well in the West, because, of course, we live at a time of huge introspection ourselves in our own societies, here, but also in Europe. And in a sense, we advertise, in a sense, our ideological weakness at a time when these rival ideologies are advertising their strength. And I think there was a complex connection between the two of them. And I think that's a political question, rather than simply a question of administration. Mm-hmm. This is a question about what sort of politics do we think we practice here? Because we can do very little as non-Muslims in the West about the Islamist ideology. What we can do is a lot about our ideology. But it has to look like success. And our politics have to work better than they do. That's my
Thank you. And Jasmine, you've worked with DoD at many levels as a translator for the 82nd and country director, I believe, for Iraq, Syria, Lebanon as well. What was the role of ideology in the discussions that you had in DoD and in DoD policy? Was this something that was thought of, or was it something that seemed like a secondary concern?
It was definitely thought of, and I think it's interesting because I've seen this issue from multiple vantage points, if you will. I was a translator in Iraq, so I was there during the war, and I got to see how people were fighting and why at that time. I also spent some time in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and got a chance to interview many of the detainees there, which those were just completely fascinating stories, very different from Iraq because they weren't necessarily involved in a war at the time when they became radicalized, but you got to listen to a lot of their stories and understand what leads someone to become radicalized. everything from boredom to low social status to lack of economic opportunity, and then someone comes along at the right time with the right message, as we discussed, and then they end up in Guantanamo Bay. In terms of policy, I was at the Department of Defense in their Middle East office during the Arab Spring, and so it was really interesting to me to see how our leadership thought about these questions as we tried to respond to what was happening across the Middle East, and trying to recognize that every country had a different context and we couldn't apply the same policy across the Middle East because not all countries were the same. So, pause. I want to go back to a conversation that I had earlier this year with a Norwegian counterterrorism expert, and he has worked with right-wing extremists for the last 20 years or so. He's the foremost expert on right-wing extremism. And so I was talking to him about de-radicalization and how someone becomes de-radicalized. You know, how does he work with them? What does he use? Does he try to propose an alternative ideology, an alternative narrative, a counter-narrative? And as he started describing what he does, I said, in a sense, is this deprogramming and reprogramming? And he got very upset. He got very offended at that term because he said, no, there's no such thing. Human beings are not robots. They're not computers. You can't program, reprogram, deprogram them. It's just not that simple. People bring their own biases and their own experiences into anything that they listen to. People listen differently to the same thing based on their own biases and their own experiences, right? So he said what he does is he changes the social reality of that person's life. If someone is a right-wing extremism and thinks, black people are lesser or this or that, then what they do things like they go to the mall and they just sit there and try to get through an hour at the mall where they can see people of different races mixing, and then slowly the reality for him or her starts to change. Now, the problem, to go back to policy, the problem that we have when it comes to incorporating ideology into policy is that we as governments are incapable of changing people's social realities. So we can come up with a great message. We can come up with and again, you said it's not the government's job to do this, but for example, let's say it's the Egyptian government and Al-Azhar, and they're trying to reformat the curricula for students, and they're trying to propose alternative ways for people to interpret Islam. Well, that's only one part of it. You can't change the realities, though. You can't say you can't have a positive message, but then the person goes home and their life is the same, right? How are they going to address their grievances, their wants, their fears, their needs with a positive message if there's nothing positive in their life? I mean, and those are the shortcomings of focusing just on ideology. This is why I get very worried when I hear recommendations that are simply focused on combating ideologies and the battle of ideas and all that stuff. And there's just no way we can win a battle of ideas because we are incapable as a government. And we saw this in the Arab Spring, where we had this huge tension between our values, the way we see ourselves as America, and our interests. And so you can't go. You can have a great message, but if you don't have the ability to back it up with tangible policies that actually make a difference in people's lives, it doesn't work. And I think the problem with us as a government, and I'm talking about our government, U.S. government, is that we're very good at defining the problem. We have analysts. We can look at a certain context and we can define what the problem is. But then when it comes to what the solutions are, we advocate for solutions that are based on a version of ourselves that we want to believe, not on the reality of who we are. Unfortunately, we want to be the government that promotes democracy and that stands up for human rights and that does all the things that we say we do, but we don't. And we can't and we won't if we just want to be really realistic about it. And I think unless we acknowledge that and take that into account when we're waging this battle of ideas, which I don't necessarily think is the right way to go, then we're going to keep dealing with this issue for years and generations to come.
Jasmine, sorry, when you said we can't win the war of ideas, we meaning the government?
I'm saying yes, because he was asking about policy making and the role that ideology plays in it. So I'm speaking from a U.S. government perspective. Yeah,
we're still friends.
I want to make a quick pivot here. Sir John, you have been working, you co-authored an influential report on the Muslim Brotherhood. We have been talking, I think, more about ideology, perhaps because of the prominence of ISIS and the fact that they have just flooded their airwaves with ideological discussion. There is, of course, a much larger Islamist wave, both violent, non-violent, somewhere in between. I wonder if you could tell us how much we should be thinking in ideological terms about a group like the Muslim Brotherhood.
I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood has shown enormous resilience over the last 80 years, and actually enormous political skill in negotiating the relationship that it has, often difficult, with governments. But governments have also the Brotherhood have instrumentalized governments, and governments have instrumentalized the Brotherhood in all sorts of different and complex ways, in a way that actually no other Islamist movement in the Middle East has succeeded in doing. I mean, the Brotherhood arose out of a particular context in the 1920s. It didn't come out of nowhere. Hassan al-Banna himself had intellectual roots in the late 19th century, and actually in the intellectual turmoil of modernist Islamic thinking, a lot of it coming out of Al-Azhar, actually, but also coming out of Syria in the late 19th century. But he was the first person, I think, al-Banna, to produce a mass mobilized ideological movement, in the sense that it was a movement designed in the Marxist way to change the world. It was a movement. It's a social revolutionary movement. They said it was from the beginning, and it always has been. And in that process of social revolution, you're allowed to use violence from time to time if that's the way in which you can achieve your goals. What al-Banna was against was not violent. I mean, I've had Muslim brothers coming out of my ears telling me that Muslim Brotherhood is essentially a non-violent movement. It's not. It's not the Islamic State, and it's not Al-Qaeda, but it's not non-violent. Violence for the Brotherhood has always been instrumental. And what al-Banna was against was not violence, was not coups. It was unsuccessful coups. If you're going to have a coup, make sure you get it right. Which, of course, it makes it interesting that twice in the Brotherhood's history, at the cruces of politics in the early 1950s and then from 2011 onwards, they made the wrong decision. They got it all wrong. Because the abiding problem with the Brotherhood is their political incompetence as well as their political skill. And out of this comes a doctrine which is very similar to the Gramscian doctrine of the Gramscian distinction between a frontal assault upon a state and a war of manoeuvre. As Rudi Dutschke put it, the great war, the long march to the institutions, which then became the Brotherhood tactic. But violence was always there as an option. And then, of course, you have Qutb. And Qutb, in Milestones and elsewhere, actually, produces, which wasn't entirely his idea, but it has a lot of similarities with sort of Marxist Leninism, with the vanguardist violence of Lenin, for example, in 1917, or indeed of some fascist movements in the 1930s. This concept of vanguardist violence, and the idea, to reverse Rousseau, that we have to kill men to be free. To make them free, we may have to kill them. And that's highly influential, and Qutb's thought is absolutely central to most variants of Islamism, including Shia variants of Islamism. If you look at Khomeini and Khamenei, they're both influenced by Qutb, and indeed by Maududi, the great Indo-Pakistani ideologue, who also was an advocate of sacralized violence in the pursuit of power. And this is at the heart, you will find, Qutb as one of the key texts taught in Daesh, in Islamic State study groups. It's the famous interview by Ahmed Mansour, the Jazeera journalist, with Al-Jilani, I think it was from 2 years ago, and he says to Al-Jilani, who was from Jabal Nusra, Jabal Fatah Hashem, and he says, why did you just call yourself the Muslim Brotherhood? Because that's what you believe. You teach Qutb and you teach al-Banna. And there's a bit of an argument about it. And Al-Jilani says, yeah, we teach Qutb. And actually there's then a cutaway to Mansour sitting in a class with a bunch of Daesh guys studying Qutb. Qutb is absolutely critical in this. So it's there. I mean, I think, again, in policy terms, dealing with this, somebody asked earlier in one of the early sessions, should you prescribe the Muslim Brotherhood? Well, the answer is, what is this thing that you're prescribing? I mean, in the UK, there is no organisation called the Muslim Brotherhood. There's a bunch of people who are Muslim brothers, but you can't prescribe people simply on the grounds of what they believe. Otherwise, we'd prescribe, a lot of governments would prescribe most departments of political science. And I apologise to any political scientists out there. Certainly any critical theory political scientists. But what you can do is follow individuals. And I think a lot of this, in terms of how government responds to this, is following individuals. It's very and money. And I think a lot of this but it's very detailed. And the amount of resource you need to do this is huge. So some of this, when you think about how government responds to this, is how much money governments are prepared to put into this sort of sustained effort to pay attention. And when I say sustained, you're talking about 20, 30, 40 years. It's not as simple as dropping a bomb on somebody and vaporizing them and thinking the problem has gone away. Of course it hasn't. But it's quicker to do it like that. You're talking about something and you have to keep repeating, and across partisan boundaries. So in the UK, one of the problems we've always had with policy in the UK is sustaining policy across general elections. And I imagine the same is probably true here in the States. It used to be easier because there used to be a bipartisan approach to all of this stuff. I think that's gone away.
I will now turn to the floor. We have time for some questions. I will be exercising a Kim Barker-like level of discipline here, so please stand up, speak loudly, give your full name, your affiliation, and I'll identify you. Yes, sir. There's a microphone coming to you here.
Thank you. My name is Mahmoud Farouk, and I'm from Project Middle East Democracy. I have a question to Jasmine. You said that the government is not able to win the battle of ideas. I agree with you in a part that the government, in a sense, is not the main player in winning the ideas, which more civil society work to do. But how? What is your answer about how do you see the winning of ideas between the liberalism and Soviet Union in the 80s? Do you think that the government back then and the state back then have done something to win the battle of ideas? And if the state is not able to win the battle of ideas, what the state should do? They just do nothing? Thank you.
Well, I wasn't around, for the Cold War, so I wasn't involved in that policy. But I think it's a very good question, and we should really look at that analogy and think about whether or not it's the right analogy. The Cold War, and of course, please feel free to jump in, but. One of the things that I see as very different between now and then is we have this what we call the say-do gap, right? And the bigger that gap is, the less credibility we have as a government in terms of what we're saying if we're not doing what we're saying. And so I think from what I understand and from what I have learned is that during the Cold War, the U.S. had a very strong narrative. It had a very strong, very streamlined narrative, and a lot of its actions and a lot of the governments and the people and the causes that we allied with at the time matched the narrative that we were putting forth against communism. If you look at today, it's a very different story, and not only is it a different story, but we're talking about when we're trying to combat radical Islamic extremism or Islamist extremism. It's tricky because you, on one hand, don't want to buy into the us versus them narrative that, for example, ISIS or Al-Qaeda puts forth, right? Like all Muslims are on one side and non-Muslims are on the other side. But inherently, you're kind of doing so. You're looking at the way that we talk about it. We look at the ideology. We talk about Muslim youth and Muslim identity, and we fail to recognize that Muslims are not all the same everywhere. And so we're doing the same thing that we're combating in a way, which is this us versus them perspective. But if you look at domestically and internationally, if we just carve our task into these two things, so our domestic narrative if there's a battle of ideas domestically and a battle of ideas internationally, well, the U.S. narrative of inclusion and democracy and all of that stuff that we believe in and that we do here in our country, that's one issue. And I think that is a battle that we can win. I mean, I think that the U.S. government can win a battle of ideas with ISIS when it comes to targeting Muslim youth in the U.S. We have a strong case to be made here. But when we try to do it abroad, the governments that we're allied with don't live up to our standards as we state them. The opportunities that people have in, for example, in the Middle East, or whether it's Indonesia or wherever, I mean, name your country, we just aren't able to match our actions with our words. And step one is just condemning actions that their governments are doing, but we can't do it because those governments are our allies. So it's just, how do you win a battle of ideas when you can't follow your ideas up with actions that match those ideas? You're going to lose every time.
Very quickly.
I think back to that famous clip from the late 50s of Nixon and Khrushchev arguing about washing machines. And Nixon says, our washing machines are better than yours. And Khrushchev says, no, we're outperforming. Our washing machines are better now and they'll be even better in the future. You could test that, actually. And it turned out the US washing machines are a lot better, got a lot better than Soviet washing machines. And the weapon systems were better than the rest of it. There was something that you could test. That was there, you could feel. And that worked. This is about the ultimate purposes of life. If you look at that, this is a salvational narrative. It's about... And that, how, in God's name, do you test that? I don't know. I mean, Tariq's point about the orthodox schools, the four orthodox schools, the main orthodox schools of Sunni Islam and the rest of their interpretations, and the contextualization of judgments in terms of interest, in terms of intentionality, fiqh al-maqasid, fiqh al-masalih, and the rest of it. This, it seems to me, because when Sisi talks about this, or actually Orthodox or the senior Saudis, they say it is the responsibility of Al-Azhar or somebody else, the Orthodox scholars, to fix this. Can they do it?
Yes.
To the satisfaction of whom?
Yeah, so that's a good thing. I mean, this comes back to the idea of liberalism, and I'm glad that Sir John was instigating this idea that this is an ideology, that it's not completely compatible with Islamic ideology, but that doesn't mean that they can't coexist.
Yeah.
But if we think that our job is to make Egypt and Tunisia and Turkey and all of these things look like American democracy, then that's a failed, because that should not be the goal. Well, that's not very liberal, just to start out with. I mean, that's not what we should be doing in the name of liberalism. But can we defeat this ideology? We can, we are, and we will.
Another question? Yes, sir.
So my name is Jean-Claude Beck from the Africa Center of Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. So my question goes to Jasmine. So terrorism is certainly not new to Africa, but I think the nature and the growth of it is changing. We defeat ISIS or Islamic State in the Middle East, it probably finds a safe haven in Africa. So my question with regards to policy-wise is, shouldn't we be doing something different in terms of countering extremism so that we don't repeat the same mistakes in the Middle East, in Africa? And if we are doing something different, what is it that we're actually doing on the ground in the region? And if we are not, what is it that we should be doing? Thank you.
Wow. So
Tariq, you've also been working in Africa, so if you want to take part of this question, then feel free.
Do you want to go first?
So can you restate the question?
Yes. So I'm saying that with the nature of terrorism changing in Africa, we have the Islamic militancy that is actually increasing. We look at places like Mali, and so in terms of policy focus, what should we be doing differently so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that we've been making in the Middle East? And if actually we're doing something different, what is it that we're doing? If we're not, what should we be doing differently in the region?
I mean, what I've done in Africa and Nigeria and Somalia and obviously Egypt. Egyptians, we forget that we're African, but we are African. So, I mean, that's another story. Sorry, Sam and Yasmin. But, and Mimi. But is the training and capacity building. I mean, the stories that I heard from these Nigerian people, I mean, I don't even want to say them publicly. I mean, these people have experienced, I met with people that have actually experienced suicide attacks, going to Friday prayer and the things that they've seen. and telling me these kids that are my kids' age being given drugs, hallucinogenics, and these type of things to bring them and to recruit. I mean, horror. You would lose your hair if I told you these stories. But what we can do is we can help train them. How do they, how do you help a school teacher, a youth group, a civil servant, an imam, a local imam? So it's not just, in this respect, yes, it's not just ideology, because they're not sitting, in the Abuja and stuff talking about, and Mogadishu talking about theology. No, that's not what, they need actual training, capacity building. How can they organize? How can they sustain the effort? And this is where I think things like IREX and USAID and these things can be deployed in a much better way, a much, much better way. I mean, I run a charity. And this whole USAID thing, as far as I'm concerned, it's like a big racket. There's only two people who get the money, and then they get the money and they don't know how to do it, so they have to subcontract it to somebody else. And it's just this whole like charade. I mean, that's not helping the people on the ground. I mean, I'm sorry, no offense to to all of these things. The money can be used in a much, much better way. The efforts that I'm involved with, like in Egypt, for example, Al-Azhar, you know what their budget is? 0. They're doing this out of the goodness of their heart. If you gave them $10, $100, think about the exponential impact that dollar will have helping those kind of efforts. So while government can't, and I'm not a government person at all, as you can tell, while government can't necessarily win the war in ideology, government can certainly help, give support to the voices that need support, help with training, help with exchange programs, help with English language training, to clerics and social media training. Rather than train people how to revolt against their countries and destabilize governments, why don't we train clerics how to use social media so they can fight the battle? I mean, that's just a no-brainer for me. I don't understand why we don't do those things. And this can be done at a fraction, 0.0001% of what we're spending on other aid projects. Sorry, I'm a little passionate about it, but I mean, it's just, these are really low-hanging fruits.
I just want to add a couple of things.
She'll give the diplomatic answer.
Well, actually, I wanted to clarify that I don't currently work for the U.S. government, so I'm definitely not speaking for the U.S. government right now. But I'm still it's going to take a while for the diplomacy, shackles to break free. But I wanted to say a couple of things, but to the other part of your question about what could we learn from mistakes that we've made in the Middle East, for example, when it comes to countering violent extremism. And then I want to answer one of your questions quickly. But the two things that come to mind, just based on my experience, in terms of what we did wrong in the Middle East, what we continue to do wrong, is we have a very militarized view of what this battle is. When we say countering violent extremism, it's really counterterrorism. I mean, it's really we use bombs, we use drones, we use armies. The counter ISIL campaign is largely a military campaign, and I think that's problematic. Counterterrorism is one thing, countering extremism and radicalization is another thing completely, and we should be using completely different tools. I mean, those things are they both need to happen on parallel tracks. But the set of tools that we use for CT, for counterterrorism, is not the same set of tools that we should be using to counter extremism. So that's one thing, is the militarization of this policy. And then the second thing is, and this is more difficult to do in government because from the president on down, you have to constantly try to balance short-term necessities and short-term threats with long-term implications of those threats and what might come out of that. So in a perfect world, we would we would do things to prevent future radicalization and to prevent future destabilization and things like that. But in the short term, sometimes we just need to do something really quickly because the threat is very immediate. The two things that I can think of off the top of my head that I thought were mistakes, not just in hindsight, but these are actually mistakes that we knew were mistakes. A lot of people who worked on these issues knew were mistakes as they were happening. One was our support of Prime Minister Maliki in Iraq. And kind of watching what he was doing and everything, and just supporting him blindly because I don't know, because we thought we had to, or because there were no alternatives, or because it would have taken too long to find an alternative and to support them. So again, short-term versus long-term. And the other, of course, tragically, is and this is a whole other debate, but it's not doing enough to prevent Syria from becoming what it has become today, and not pushing back against President Assad enough at the very beginning, not using diplomatic means that we had available, and things like that. And so one of the lessons learned, I would say, is as we're formulating policies to counter extremism, to do a little bit better at looking at the long-term, second and third and fourth order effects of those immediate decisions, and to think about whether we're actually creating more problems for ourselves 20 years down the road.
Very fast.
Just one very quickly. There's some very interesting work done on bits of West Africa, particularly Francophone West Africa at the moment, Gabon, Senegal, and so forth, which haven't produced this level of Islamist extremism. And the reasons why. And some of these seems to be structural, some of them seem to be connected with the existence of very strong Sufi brotherhoods and the rest of it. I mean, so in a way, this stuff I think we can also learn from bits of West Africa, the varied experience of West Africa in particular about this. So.
All right. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all. And thank you to BPC. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, and to our panelists and to our audience for attending and sticking with us through an action-packed day that involved both Game of Thrones and Gramsci, which I'm eager to hear more about at some point. I had three takeaways from today, which is agreement on the persistence of the terrorist threat, broad agreement about the insufficiency of the counterterrorism tools that we're currently deploying in attenuating that threat, and some disagreements about what we need to do or what we're able to do as a U.S. government in fighting the battle of ideas, whether it's at home or abroad. And so because we're the Bipartisan Policy Center, we look forward to taking all of those conflicting and divergent views and trying to fit them into a comprehensive strategy and a consensus-based strategy for fighting terrorism, and we look forward to rolling that out in the near future with Governor Kaine and Congressman Hamilton. So I hope you'll all be able to join us for that, and please stay tuned for more news of our project. Thank you.